Hey, are you back already? Did you have a nice night? I hope you enjoyed your Halloween party. I must admit I've enjoyed myself a great deal tonight, guarding your porch and the little cauldron of candy you left out here. But the night is still young, and we might yet be visited by little witches, ghosts, and monsters. Why don't you sit down on the porch, and while we keep a lookout for stragglers and latecomers, I can tell you some scary stories to pass the time. I think I might have a few good ones that you haven't heard before. The first story takes place far to the north, where it's dark most of the day in winter. And in such a place there was once a woman who lived by herself in a small town. On Christmas Eve, she put her alarm on early for the next morning because she wanted to go to an early Christmas morning mass. When she woke up, it was not from her alarm. It was dark, of course. Her bedside alarm clock had stopped, so she couldn't tell the time. But she looked out the window and saw that the lights were on in the little town church. It must be morning, she thought to herself, and I have overslept. So she got out of bed, dressed quickly, and left the house. The streets were empty and quiet, and she saw no one else out and about, but she did not dwell on it, for she was late for church and had to hurry. She arrived a few minutes later, entered the church, and sat down on her usual seat. She thought the people around her were strangely pale and quiet, and she did not recognize them, even though the church was almost full. The priest stood at the altar and was giving a beautiful sermon. But it was not the usual priest. It was a tall, pale man, and the woman thought there was something familiar about him. She took a closer look and realized it was the old priest. She recognized him from her childhood. He had been dead for many years. There were no coughing or shuffling of feet in the church. In fact, there were no sound at all. It was eerily quiet. The only sound was the priest's voice. The woman took a look around her again and recognized the woman sitting next to her. It was her neighbor who had been dead and buried more than 3 years ago. Her neighbor leaned in and whispered, "We were friends when I was alive. So I will give you this advice now. as long as the priest is preaching, we will sit still in our seats. But as soon as the priest is done, everyone here will come after you. This Mass is for the dead. The night belongs to us, and the living are not welcome. Leave now while you still can, and make sure to loosen your coat around you. The woman unbuttoned her coat and hurried out of the church. From each pew, cold, pale hands reached out for her, but they only got hold of her coat, and she slipped out of it, left it behind, and ran out of the church and all the way home. In the morning, when people arrived at the church, they found her coat on the church steps, torn to pieces. Don't you believe me? Every word is true, I swear. This happened to a friend of my grandmother, in fact. She told me herself. She even kept a piece of the coat. It was red wool, quite nice. I saw the piece with my own eyes when I was a child. My grandfather also had many stories to tell. He lived a long and adventurous life, and knew very well that there exists more between heaven and earth than most people realize. But this short story, which also takes place during Christmas, is about what someone else saw. When my grandfather was very young, no more than 10 years old, he lived on a farm with his family. On Christmas Eve that year, they had extended family visiting, and they were all gathered around the table for Christmas dinner. In the middle of dinner, there was a knock at the door. One of the guests, the one sitting closest to the door, got up to see who it was. She was a cousin of my grandfather, I think, a young woman. But when she opened the door, there was no one there. She took a few steps outside, looked around, and happened to look in through the window and saw everyone sitting around the table, having dinner. She saw her brother among them, but he seemed to have no head, and next to him was another headless person. And the strangest thing of all, this other person was wearing exactly the same clothes as she was. When she came back inside, she told everyone what she had seen. The room went quiet, my grandfather said. It was eerie, and he didn't understand why. But the adults around the table knew what the omen meant. Just a few days later, both the young woman and her brother died in an accident. There are a few nights a year, you see, that are different from others, when you can see things, notice things, omens of death, birth, riches or sorrows to come. Nights when the veil between the living and the dead are thinner than usual. And Christmas Eve is one such night. So is Halloween, for that matter. The next story is about the drowned dead. Those who are lost at sea do not get a proper burial, and the drowned ones can often not find peace. When they are observed on land, they can look like ordinary sailors, or they can make themselves look like a rock or a log covered in seaweed until you get close to them. If encountered at sea, they can be seen floating by themselves on the surface, or sitting in half a boat, a broken vessel that should not be able to stay afloat. Seeing or hearing one of them is often considered a bad omen. If one of them sits down in a boat at shore, the next person sitting in the same spot will die soon. The drowned can also come ashore, follow people around, and sometimes even attack them. It is safest to stay further up from the shore than the water can reach at high tide. But that's enough rules and advice. Let's get on with the story. This one happened to my father's younger sister many years ago. She used to live in a small fishing village on the coast with her husband, who was a fisherman. But the year after he died, she moved back to the city where the rest of her relatives lived. This surprised my father quite a bit, because she had often exclaimed how much she loved living in that beautiful little village. But when she moved back to the city, she didn't give a reason. She just said something had happened that made it intolerable for her to stay there. A few years later, my father asked again, and since distant events can be easier to talk about than recent ones, my aunt finally told him what had happened. One night, she was sitting at home listening to a storm outside. The rain was pouring down and the wind was strong. The storm got wilder and wilder as the night progressed. She was worried about her husband, who was out at sea in a small fishing boat. Despite the late hour, he had not yet returned. She had a pot of stew on the stove, for she wanted a hot meal ready for whenever her husband came home, and she was too worried to go to bed anyway. So she sat up, waiting and waiting. Finally, very late at night, she heard the door in the hallway opening and someone coming inside. She ran out to meet her husband, and there he was, standing just inside the door, soaking wet with rain and seawater. She asked him to hurry and change out of his wet clothes and come into the living room to warm up by the fireplace. And then she busied herself in the kitchen, preparing a bowl of warm stew for him. But as she was doing so, she realized that the hallway was now completely quiet. And when she called out her husband's name, there was no answer. She went back to the entrance, and there was nobody there. She walked through the whole house, looking for him in every room, but she was all alone. But by the door, right where she had seen her husband, was a big puddle of water. She sat up the whole night, unable to go to bed. In the morning, the priest came to her door and informed her that her husband and his crew were lost at sea, assumed to be dead. The wreckage of his boat had been found, but no survivors. In fact, he was never found. But my aunt did see him again, from time to time. He would open the door late at night, walk in, and remain just inside the door, soaking wet from the storm that had long since passed, and he always left a puddle of seawater on the floor. No wonder my aunt didn't want to live there anymore. What do you think of my stories, friend? Have my voice lulled you to sleep or kept you wide awake? Either way, I think you've had quite enough for one night. It can't have been easy to come home from a Halloween party with friends, sit down on your own porch, and start hearing a voice next to you. And who knows if I'm another restless spirit, or if you are simply going mad. One thing is for certain, though. I am not really here.